The boat had been sitting under a blue tarp behind my place for almost a year before I finally got the engine running clean, and the first to see it happen was Marin, standing on her side of the fence with a mug of coffee, watching me swear at a bilge pump like it owed me money. "You're going to hurt yourself," she said. "I already have twice." I held up my knuckles, scraped raw from a wrench that had slipped an hour earlier. "Worth it, though." She leaned on the fence post, the wood soft and gray from years of salt air, and looked at the boat the way you'd look at a stray dog somebody brought home. Half impressed, half worried about the mess it was going to make. It was a 31-foot sailboat, older than both of us combined, with a hull I'd sanded down to bare fiberglass and a mast I'd re-rigged twice because I got it wrong the first time. I'd bought it for almost nothing from a guy in Portland who wanted it gone before winter, and I'd spent every free hour since then, trying to make it something that could actually go somewhere. "So what's the plan?" Marin asked. "Sail it around the harbor and call it a day?" "The plan is Maine to Florida, down the coast. No schedule." She laughed, short and surprised. "By yourself, that's the plan." "Sounds lonely, that's also the plan." I hadn't meant it as an invitation. I want to be clear about that, because afterward it got twisted into some kind of long game. Like I'd been angling for this from the start and I hadn't. I'd been divorced 11 months. Marin had been divorced almost 2 years, and in that time we'd become the kind of neighbors who wave and sometimes borrow tools, and once, after a bad ice storm, split a bottle of bourbon on her porch, because both our power was out and neither of us wanted to sit alone in the dark. That was the whole history. Fence post conversations and one night of bourbon. So when I said, half joking, "Come with me then, if it sounds so lonely," I said it the way you say something you don't expect anyone to take seriously. A throwaway line, a joke with a shrug built into it. Marin didn't even set her coffee down first. "Okay?" I actually laughed because I thought that was the joke landing. Her playing along, topping my line with her own. "Okay like haha okay, or okay like okay?" "Okay like give me until Saturday." I stood there in the mud with a wrench in my hand and my mouth slightly open, waiting for the part where she smiled and said she was kidding. She didn't. She just picked her coffee back up, looked at the boat one more time like she was already doing inventory in her head, and went inside without another word, the screen door banging shut behind her. I told myself she'd forget by Saturday. People say things on porches in October that they don't mean by the weekend. I kept working on the boat anyway, because the boat needed to be ready regardless of who was or wasn't coming. And some stubborn, quiet part of me had started hoping she meant it, even though I would not have admitted that to a single living person. Saturday morning she was on the dock at 6:40 with a duffel bag, a rolled-up sleeping bag, and a cooler she'd clearly packed with more care than I'd packed anything in my entire life. "You're serious," I said. "I told you I was. You didn't ask about the boat, whether it's actually safe, whether I know what I'm doing." She looked at me unbothered, hair pulled back under a faded ball cap that used to belong, I later found out, to her ex-husband, which she wore now purely out of spite and practicality. "Do you know what you're doing?" "Mostly." "Good enough." She handed me the cooler. I packed real food. Not whatever survival nonsense you had planned. Her name was Marin Iverson. She was 38, 4 years older than me, a physical therapist at a clinic 2 towns over. Calm in a way that made me more aware of my own nervous energy. And I would learn over the next 2 weeks. Much better at reading weather than I was, despite having grown up nowhere near the ocean. She'd married young, to a man named Curtis, who eventually decided he wanted a different life than the one he'd built with her. And she'd spent the 2 years since then doing exactly what she accused herself of doing later. Getting very good at getting through days without actually living any of them. None of that came out on day one. Day one was just logistics. Where to stow her bag, how the marine head worked. Why I had exactly one frying pan and she was already regretting not bringing her own. We motored out of the harbor a little after 7, the engine sounding rougher than I wanted it to. And by the time the coastline started shrinking behind us, both of us were laughing about something so small I don't even remember what it was anymore. That's usually how the good parts start. Not with a big moment, with something small enough that you don't notice it's already happening. The first real trouble came 2 days later, off the coast near a stretch of nothing in particular, when the wind died completely and the motor, my backup, my supposed safety net, started sputtering every time I pushed past idle. "That doesn't sound right," Marin said, watching me from the cockpit while I lay half over the engine compartment with grease on my forearms. "It's fine. You've said it's fine 3 times in the last 10 minutes. It's very fine." The motor died completely. 20 minutes later, right as the current started pulling us gently toward a sandbar I did not want to meet. I dropped the anchor faster than I'd ever dropped anything in my life, heart going harder than the situation probably called for. And when it finally caught and held, I sat back in the cockpit and put my head in my hands. "Well," Marin said, Great start, please don't. I'm just saying. Day 2. I looked up at her, ready to be annoyed, and found her smiling. Not at me exactly, more at the situation, at the absurdity of 2 adults floating dead in the water off the coast of nowhere. Because I hadn't replaced a fuel filter I knew needed replacing. I couldn't stay annoyed with someone smiling like that. I laughed instead, mostly out of exhaustion, and she reached into the cooler and handed me a sandwich like this was a perfectly reasonable time for lunch. We're not having an engine crisis on an empty stomach, she said. That's a rule now. It took 4 hours, most of a toolkit, and one moment where I had to submerge my entire arm in bilge water. I did not want to think too hard about, but I got the fuel filter cleared and the motor turning over again. Marin held the flashlight for me the whole time, even in daylight, mostly so she had something to do with her hands, and she narrated my failures back to me with a dry commentary that somehow made the whole ordeal easier instead of worse. You have the face of a man who thinks this is under control. It is under control, sure it is. By evening we'd only made it to a cove I hadn't planned on stopping at, tucked behind a spit of rock with a scraggly stand of pines on the shore. It wasn't where I meant to be, but it was quiet. And we anchored there and cooked a very mediocre pot of rice and beans on my single-burner stove. And for about 20 minutes it felt like the trip had found its rhythm. Then the sky did what it does on the coast of Maine in early October, which is change its mind entirely without warning. Marin saw it first. She always saw weather before I did. Some instinct she'd picked up I never asked about. That's not good, she said, nodding at a wall of gray moving in low over the water, and within 10 minutes we were fighting to get the cockpit cover secured while the wind tried to take it out of our hands. Rain coming down not as drops but as sheets, cold enough to make my teeth chatter despite the exertion. This boat does not have room for 2 people to panic at once, Marin shouted over the wind, hauling a soaked duffel bag below deck. Then don't panic, I'm not panicking, I'm organizing. There's a difference. We spent the next hour crammed into the cabin, wet gear piled everywhere. Both of us peeling off soaked layers in a small space that had absolutely no dignity left to offer either of us, laughing at the sheer indignity of it because the alternative was to be miserable, and misery didn't seem worth the energy. Marin sat wrapped in the spare blanket I kept under the settee, water still dripping off one side of her jaw, and said, with a completely straight face, I would like it noted for the record that this glamorous sailing life is exactly as advertised. I handed her dry socks. You could go home, there's a marina 6 miles back. She looked up at me from inside the blanket. I'm not going home because of some rain and bad rice. That landed harder than the sentence should have given how simple it was. We didn't sleep much that night. The boat rocked too hard. My back complained about the narrow berth, and Marin stole most of the blanket and denied it every single time I brought it up. By morning the storm had passed, leaving the cove glassy and strange and quiet, and we made coffee in the cockpit in that particular silence that follows a bad night, both too tired to bother pretending we looked or felt fine. That became the shape of the days that followed. Nothing went entirely right, but somehow it kept getting better anyway. We missed a channel marker because I was distracted by her telling me about the apartment she'd rented after Curtis left. A place above a dry cleaner's, where the chemical smell never fully left her clothes, no matter how many times she washed them. And by the time we noticed we'd drifted off our intended course, we'd ended up in a hidden inlet neither of us had a name for, ringed by rock and a single osprey nest with nobody else sight. See, Marin said, bumping my shoulder with hers as we ate crackers in the cockpit and looked at it. Your terrible navigation works out. That wasn't navigation. That was an accident. Still counts. One night, anchored somewhere off a stretch of coastline with no lights visible anywhere, we heard something bumping against the hull near the stern. Not dangerous, just unfamiliar. A low knock and scrape that made both of us go quiet and still in the dark cockpit. There, Marin whispered, pointing. I couldn't see anything at first. Then I caught the shape. A harbor seal, curious and bold, nosing around near where I'd hung a bag of bait for the crab trap I'd optimistically brought along and never actually used. It wasn't a threat. It was almost funny once I understood what it was. But in the 2 or 3 seconds before I figured that out, Marin's hand had found my arm and closed around it, gripping hard enough that I felt it the next morning. Don't move, she said. It's a seal. I know that now. I didn't know that 4 seconds ago. I banged the hull once with my palm and the seal slid back into the water without much drama at all, and Marin let out a long breath and started laughing. The kind of laugh that comes from being tired and a little embarrassed and mostly relieved all at once. We are terrible at this, she said. We're learning. She was still holding my arm. Neither of us mentioned it. When she finally let go, it took longer than it needed to, and we sat there afterward, in the dark, not talking, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off her shoulder. Both of us aware that something in the space between us had quietly shifted, and neither of us had the nerve to name it yet. The real turn happened 4 nights later, in a harbor town called Beaufort, in a rented room above a bait shop that smelled like diesel and salt, no matter how many windows we opened. We'd had another rough day, a torn sail, a lost dinghy line, an argument about whether we should have replaced the bilge pump before leaving Maine, which I'd lost decisively. And by the time we found a place to shower and sleep on solid ground, both of us were running on fumes. Marin came out of the shower in an oversized t-shirt that wasn't hers, borrowed from a shop downstairs because everything she owned was still damp, her hair wet and dark against her neck, and something about the ordinary domesticity of it, her drying her hair with a towel, complaining about the water pressure, made the small room feel suddenly much smaller than it had a minute earlier. We ate gas station food on the bed, because nothing nearby was still serving. Marin sat cross-legged near the headboard, picking the salt off a bag of chips one piece at a time while I sat at the foot of its mattress pretending to be very interested in a muted weather report. "You've been quiet," she said. "For like an hour. I'm tired." "You're not tired. You're doing the thing where you go quiet because you're thinking too hard about something." I looked over at her. She had that flat, patient expression she used when she already knew the answer and was just waiting for me to catch up to it myself. After 2 weeks on a boat together, there wasn't much room left to hide things. She knew when I was annoyed before I did. She knew when I was worried about money. She'd apparently known this was coming before I let myself admit it. "This stopped feeling like a favor to a neighbor a while ago," I said. It came out clumsier than I wanted, but it was the only version of the sentence I had. Marin didn't answer right away. She set the chip bag down beside her, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. "I know. That should have made it easier." It didn't, not exactly, but it also loosened something in my chest that had been tight for days. I laughed once, mostly at myself, and rubbed the back of my neck. "Okay, good. That makes me more nervous, somehow." That got a real smile out of her, the kind she didn't hand out for free. She shifted closer, not in a rush, just enough that our knees touched on the narrow bed. "You think I got on that boat because I wanted a nice view? I don't know why you got on that boat. I thought you were having some kind of breakdown, honestly. Rebuilding a boat in your backyard for a year. Talking about sailing to Florida like it was a completely normal thing a person does. Maybe I was having a breakdown. Maybe," she said. But somewhere between the dead engine and the storm and the seal incident, I stopped thinking about my ex-husband for the first time in 2 years. I stopped thinking about the clinic and the mortgage and my mother asking every Sunday if I'm doing okay in that voice. That means she doesn't believe me. I just stopped. She looked at me. "That's not nothing. Is that good?" "It's good when normal felt like being asleep with your eyes open." That sentence stayed with me the way the honest ones from her always did. She wasn't someone who dressed things up to sound better than they were, so when she said something plainly, it carried more weight than a speech would have. She told me more that night than she had the entire 2 weeks before it, about the last stretch of her marriage, the slow way it had gone quiet rather than exploding, the particular exhaustion of maintaining a life that looked fine from the outside, while feeling almost entirely empty from the inside. Nothing dramatic. That was the part that struck me. It was the ordinary kind of unhappiness, the kind nobody throws a story around, and somehow that made it land harder. "I got very good at getting through days," she said. "That's all it was, for a long time." I didn't have some wise response ready. I just said, "You don't seem like that right now." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she leaned in and kissed me, unhurried, like it was the natural conclusion to 2 weeks of small moments rather than a single sudden one. Outside, the harbor made its usual late-night noises. Halyards knocking against masts, a distant radio, water against the pilings, and none of it mattered very much anymore. By morning, we were short on money in a way that stopped being funny. I sat at the little table by the window going over receipts, fuel, dock fees, the room, groceries, doing the math twice because I didn't like the answer the first time. "That bad?" Marin asked, coming out of the bathroom toweling her hair. "We need to be smarter from here. A lot smarter." She sat down across from me without any panic in her expression, just steady attention. "Show me. We cut everything we could. No more paid marinas unless we had to, cheaper food, fewer detours." I hated admitting I'd underestimated the cost by this much, months of planning, and I'd still gotten it wrong. Marin listened to the whole accounting, then reached into her bag and slid $200 across the table without making a production of it. "No," I said automatically. "Yes. I chose to come. This is both of our problem now, not just yours." I started to argue again, and she put her hand flat over mine on the table. "Stop trying to carry the whole thing by yourself. That's not what this is." That should have embarrassed me. Instead, it did something else entirely. It made me start picturing a version of the future that had nothing to do with this trip specifically. and everything to do with not wanting it to end when the trip did. We still argued plenty after that, about anchoring technique, about whether the weather radio was being dramatic, about who left the hatch open during a squall that soaked half the cabin. But the arguments had a different texture now, less like two strangers negotiating, more like two people who'd already decided they were staying and were just working out the terms. The last week of the trip, the boat settled into a rhythm neither of us had to think about anymore. Maren handed me coffee before I asked for it. I checked the rigging at every stop without being told. We packed faster, cleaned up faster, argued less, and knew without discussing it when the other person needed quiet, instead of conversation. It should have made the final stretch home easy. Instead, it made every mile feel expensive, because we both knew what was waiting at the end of it. Not some disaster, just ordinary life. Her house, my place next door. The same quiet street where all of this had started as a joke on a Tuesday morning in October. 2 hours from the marina, the motor started acting up again. A rough pull, then a shudder. Then a grinding sound from somewhere underneath that made my stomach drop. I killed the engine before it could get worse, and we drifted under sail alone for a while. The silence between us different now than it had been on any of the earlier breakdowns. Of course, Maren said, looking out at the water. Yeah, of course. I spent 45 minutes with my head in the engine compartment, hands black with grease, while Maren passed me tools and asked short useful questions, and stayed quiet when I needed her to. It turned out to be a loose belt, nothing catastrophic, but bad enough to eat the last of our daylight. When I climbed back out, she handed me a water bottle and looked at me with an expression I recognized from the motel room. Steady, unguarded, done pretending. We can still make it before dark, I said. She nodded, but she wasn't looking at the boat. She was looking at me. We motored the last stretch into the harbor, as the sun dropped low over the water. Neither of us talking much, not because anything was wrong, but because it had stopped being simple. The question we'd both managed to keep just ahead of us, the entire trip was finally sitting right there in the cockpit between us. Was any of this only real because we were moving? When the marina came into view, and beyond it the familiar shape of our street with her house first and mine just after, something in my chest tightened in a way I hadn't expected. I brought the boat in slow, killed the engine at the dock, and for a moment neither of us moved to tie off the lines. So, I said, looking at my hands instead of her. I guess this is the part where everything goes back to normal. I regretted it the second it left my mouth. Maren was quiet long enough that I finally turned to look at her. She had one hand resting on the strap of her duffel bag but hadn't picked it up. I don't want normal, she said. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure I'd heard her correctly. She let out a breath and looked past me, toward the dark shapes of our two houses up the hill from the water. I mean it. I don't want to walk back into that house, unpack, and let this become some story I tell myself about a wild couple of weeks before going back to my actual life. My pulse was loud enough to feel stupid. Maren. No, let me say it. There was a small shake in her voice now, not much, just enough to make it real. I got on that boat because I was tired of feeling like I'd already lived the rest of my life, and was just filling in the remaining days. And somewhere between the dead engine and the storm and the seal that scared me half to death, I started remembering what it felt like to actually be here, present, not managing something, just here. She looked at me directly then, none of the deflection she usually carried around like armor. You think I came on this trip for the scenery? I don't know why you came. I was falling asleep in my own life, Jack. You were just there the night I finally noticed. I didn't have a clever answer, all I had was the truth. Then stay, I said, rougher than I meant it to sound. She held my gaze another second, then let out a small disbelieving laugh, like she'd been waiting the entire trip home for exactly one clear reason not to step back into her old pattern. She reached down, picked up her duffel bag, and instead of stepping onto the dock toward her own front door, she set it down inside the cockpit next to mine. No speech, no drama, just a choice made plainly. That's it, I said. That's it. You're not going home? She glanced up the hill toward the dark windows of the house she'd left 3 weeks earlier, then back at me, and something in her face had already settled into an answer. I am home.